To the far north, beyond the lands of Redania, lies the kingdom that is rarely heard from, the kingdom of Kovir, and we join Dijkstra as he sails across the Gulf of Praxida. Now, a quick history lesson on the far north kingdoms. They were originally thought of as badlands. No farming or livestock could flourish, as the soil was barren. But their original ruler, Radovid I's exiled brother, turned the land into a thriving, rich mining kingdom, surpassed only by the dwarves of Mahakam, contributing 80% of the land's gold and a complete monopoly of the world's salt and glass. After exiling his brother, Radovid had the audacity to attempt to tax them to oblivion, to which the kingdom replied with a strongly worded refusal. By the lifetime of King Radovid III, he had decided to send an invasion force of Redania and Kedweni forces, but to the surprise of everyone in the south, Kovir and Povis have amassed an elite, well-trained, well-funded, well-paid, and experienced army, and even though outnumbered, the invasion force is crushed within a week. This forced Radovid to parley and to sail to Kovir, much like Dijkstra is doing now. Once Radovid reached Kovir, he is greeted as a welcomed guest, and their current ruler, Godovius, had Radovid sign a document making Kovir a sovereign nation. King Godovius and his wife would go on to live long, happy lives ruling over Kovir, raising children, always a peaceful nation, never at war, and always neutral. Dijkstra arrives in Kovir and is greeted by their current ruler, King Thyssen, and his wife. They exchange pleasantries before making their way to a more private place for conversation. Thyssen wishes to waste no time and asks Dijkstra the point of his visit. He sought funding for their war with Nilfgaard, to which Thyssen declines, but it's far from the end of their conversation. Though a spy and hated by most, Thyssen respected Dijkstra, and as such he saw fit to inform Dijkstra of Nilfgaard's plan to invade the north in the coming spring. But we don't hear it from him. We hear it from Cantarella, reporting to Asir all she had learned from Vatir, and Asir would then repeat it to Philippa, who shares all the information that she learns with their circle formed in baptism of fire, all just proving that no information is sacred in this world. Before Dijkstra departs Kovir, he meets with Thyssen one final time, this time alone, without his wife in attendance. The two get along better than we see Dijkstra get along with anyone in the series, and to make a long conversation short, Thyssen agrees to fund Dijkstra in his war efforts in exchange for a bribe for his own, concluding our time in Kovir. The last time we heard about Yennefer, she was the subject of a tale in which a sorceress was caught in a fishing net and brought to Caer Trold in Skellige. This is where we are now. Yennefer was in a large mass of women, crowded on the docks, awaiting the return of their people from their sea voyage. Women cheered and wept alike, depending on the fates of their loved ones. The last off the longboats was Caer Trold's ruler, Krakon Crate. He very quickly noticed Yen and approached her. He told her first thing tomorrow, she would be sailed to Novigrad and given to Redania or Temeria authorities, whoever claimed her first. Krak believed, like many others, that Yennefer had sided with Vilgefortz and Nilfgaard during the events now being referred to as the Mage Rebellions. He doesn't give her a chance to defend her innocence and begins to walk away, but she captivates his interest by saying she will not go to Novigrad, but instead he will help her fulfill a vow they both took 10 years ago, a vow regarding the Lioness of Cintra. Fast forward to the main hall, where the weary sailors were stuffing themselves with seafood. Yennefer made use of the time by pleading her innocence to Krak, and it takes a great deal of effort, but eventually, he makes the decision to trust her. He then reflects on Ciri's time in Skellige. She was just a little girl at the time, but she would play with the boys in their competitions, where they would compete to see who could jump over the largest bunch of frozen stalagmites. Ciri not only kept up, but she even held the record, which forced Krak's son Hjalmar to attempt an even bigger leap, which led to him falling and breaking quite a few of his bones, including a couple ribs as well as a leg. While he was bedridden, Ciri would read him stories and stay by his side. They had a very sweet childhood romance. At one point, they even wished to be betrothed. But that spring, when she returned home, was when Nilfgaard's invasion occurred, and she was long thought dead. Hjalmar participated in the ships that went to their aid, so he got a lot of his combat experience fighting Nilfgaardians in an effort to avenge Ciri's death. Once Croc finishes recalling fond memories of a simpler time, he asks Yennefer what it is she requires from him. She needed a massive diamond for a telecommunicator she intended to build, to speak to several people at once. Croc told Yen there was only one gem that big in all of Skellige, and so they sailed to Hyandersfall, to the Temple of Modern Freya. Once they arrived, they are greeted by the head druid priestess, Sigdrifa. Typically, sorceresses and priests/priestesses don't get along. Mages' beliefs of magic conflict with the ideals and beliefs of religion. But Yennefer carried out a good deed in her brief time on the Isles. She assisted a pregnant woman on a beach who was suffering from contractions. Knowing this, Mother Sigdrifa was more than willing to meet with her, and so Yennefer dismissed Croc, and the two spoke. Lying in the main courtyard of the temple was a giant statue of Modern Freya, and she was adorned with a necklace. The center of the necklace was a massive diamond, exactly what Yen needed. However, the necklace was secured to the statue and could not be easily removed, which, needless to say, threw a wrench into the simple plan. The head priestess knew Ciri and wished to help Yennefer, and offered a solution. She requested Yennefer join her for prayer. Hesitant at first, as I said, Yen has no religious ties whatsoever, but she eventually gets talked into trying. After a deal of Yennefer's cynical inner monologue, she's taken into somewhat of a trance that would be even harder to write than it was to read. Basically, she thinks it's simply a hallucination due to incense, but she spoke with Modern Freya, and she said a lot of cryptic things and judged Yennefer's character. It leaves Yennefer with a lot of questions, and even some reserves about how religion actually is on the island. But eventually she's woken up. Once Yennefer finally wakes, and even to all of the priestess's surprise, the jewel that was securely attached to the statue of Freya's neck was instead sitting at her feet, setting Yennefer's plan in motion. She begins building her lab at Hyandersfall, and Croc puts several people at her disposal. Though Croc trusted Yennefer, he still had one of his people report her discussions. She told Croc that Yen would discuss things like the Tower of Gulls and the Tower of Swallows, as well as Vilgefortz and the Sedna Abyss, Skellige's own little Bermuda Triangle, where Pavita, Ciri's mother, died/disappeared. Croc only truly wanted to look out for Yennefer, because, as it mentions, they have a romantic history in the past. Nothing too serious, but Croc even tries to make some passes at her, and she refuses, politely. A few weeks go by, and Skellige is visited by yet another mage, Triss Marigold. She joins Croc for dinner, and just to refresh your memory, Triss last heard that Yen was dead, so contrary to Croc's initial thought, she was not present to report to the raven-haired sorceress. Triss asks Croc what had happened to Yennefer, to which Croc replies, the truth, bringing Triss up to speed regarding what happened following Yen being brought up in a fishing net. We learn that Triss, much like everybody else, was trying to track down Ciri. She obtained a political report that tracked where mages went following Thened, and the most logical conclusion that they could reach was that Vilgefortz must have had Ciri, as she now knew that Yennefer didn't have her, and Vilgefortz was the only mage that couldn't be tracked following the events. Back in the swamps, Visigoda and Ciri are fishing for eels. By now, Visigoda knew Ciri's story rather well, but they're discussing something that I'd like to clarify really quick. So, in this world, there are two towers containing teleportation portals that are connected to each other. Tor Lara, the Tower of the Gulls, which was the tower that Ciri used to escape Vilgefortz on Thanedd, and the Tower of Swallows, or Zerael, was more of a mystery. Most people claimed that it didn't even exist. For a while, Ciri's escape from the swamps seemed impossible, but Visigoda began to theorize that if she were to find the Tower of Swallows, it would take her back to Thanedd, despite the Tower of Gulls being warped, and the reason why she ended up in the desert. He was confident that it would work, leaving only one problem: the location of the tower. Luckily for Ciri, however, she lived with a crazy old hermit who spent most of his life as a scholar. They have what is essentially a research montage before he opens up an old scroll, regarded as hogwash to any self-respecting scholar. In the tale, it references an elf named Avallac'h, as well as a tower materializing out of nowhere, in an area referred to by modern residents as the Land of 100 Lakes. Back on Skellige, Yen was hard at work, devising a plan to find Ciri. With Croc's blessing, she took 2 longships filled with 15 volunteers, which wasn't hard to find. When promising sea battle to people from Skellige, they tend to jump on board. Before she arrived in the Sedna Abyss, she sent a telecommunication to Triss, but as Yennefer quickly sniffed out, she wasn't alone. Philippa emerged from the shadows, but it didn't bother Yen as much as it should have, as the nature of her call could be taken up with Philippa anyway. Yennefer thought there was a significant possibility that she would die on her current mission, and if that were to happen, she wished for her name to be cleared to Geralt and the rest of the world, as she never paid any allegiance to Nilfgaard or Vilgefortz. But unfortunately, this conversation would get her nowhere, as Philippa sought that her own agenda would be fit easier if Yennefer was a traitor. Whether it be true or not, it served her needs. Classic Philippa, right? Real giver. This greatly saddened Triss, and I feel like if this were to happen at any point in the Witcher game, she would have done something about it, but at this time, she simply just apologizes. 2 weeks pass, and we're slung forward to a captain of one of the 2 longships that joined Yennefer. But he was before Croc back in Skellige. He brings Croc up to speed regarding why Yen was no longer with him, and why only 1 longship returned. When the ship's captain recalls the events, he tells of a horrific storm that onset as soon as they arrived at the Abyss. Massive waves threw their ships all over the sea, and soon, the ship carrying Yennefer rose from the sea, being carried by a tornado of water that erupted from beneath the longship. The second longship tried to row to their aid, but were forcefully pushed backwards. Eventually, the first ship rose so far into the sky that it vanished into a black cloud. The other ship was greatly damaged. They had to limp their way back home and tell Croc of what had happened. Not knowing how to handle the news, Croc is sent into a deep thought, but whether or not he devises a rescue mission, we'll have to wait and find out. A lot of events in this novel are told in a storyteller's fashion, whereas the events of the main focus are told from the future perspective. The beginning of Chapter 10 is an example of this. In a Nilfgaardian prison, the telepath Joanna Selborn recalls the events of a year in the past. She was a part of Stefan Skellen's party pursuing Bonhart following Ciri's capture. She reflects a meeting she had with Skellen. She warned him that she suspected a spy was among them. She would occasionally pick up thoughts of someone not apart from their group, so she suggested that they stage a pancake treatment. The next morning, at their briefing, Skellen loudly announces that they were going over important documents. Once Joanna noticed the extra voice, she gives the order to spring the trap. One of the men throws a tray of cream over the invisible visitor, and another throws a tray of flour to easily see the spy. Then they grab him and tie him up to a chair in the tent. They then remove a mask from his face, which gave him invisible capabilities. Skellen knew at once who their new prisoner was. Tied up and terrified, Rience sat before the hunting party. Skellen began heating up a cast iron pick that he intended to torture him with. Joanna read his mind the whole time. Fear made his defense very weak. But before anything can occur to the spy, Rience gets a lucky break. A man approaches their camp. He was riding a large bay mare, and with him was an ashen-haired girl with green eyes, with a chain fastened around her neck. Ciri had been in the swamp with Visigoda for 30 days now, and she was developing a case of cabin fever. Visigoda returned from a nearby village to find Ciri rummaging through his daughter's old clothes. He knew as soon as he saw her what she was doing. She was packing and planning to leave. He tells her that while he was gone, he learned that her pursuers were very close. A group of goons were terrorizing the locals of nearby villages. Ciri wants to know where and who these men were, as she wished to duke out some vigilante justice, saying that witchers deal with monsters. This triggers a huge heated argument between Ciri and the hermit. Ciri wanting justice, and Visigoda arguing that she had no right to play judge, jury, and executioner. In an eventual attempt to justify her reasonings, she angrily insists that she finish the tale of the events that brought her to the swamp in the first place, which puts us right back to Bonhart taking Ciri to Stefan Skellen. Bonhart ripped Ciri from the saddle and attached a leash to her chain before dragging her to Skellen. Rience was now free from his restraints. Skellen may have heated up the mage, but after their friendly talk earlier, he deemed they had similar goals. After some awkward pleasantries with Bonhart, the three have a private meeting. Bonhart's initial task was to kill Ciri, along with the other rats, but her combat skills caused him to spare her, and good thing too, because he eventually realized how important she was. So he brought her back to Skellen to renegotiate his contract. Rience pulls out a small silver box he uses to speak with his master, Vilgefortz, kind of like a magical cell phone. Vilgefortz was now armed with the knowledge that Ciri was in his grasp, so he begins winning over the allegiances of the capture party. Vilgefortz offers Bonhart 2,000 marks, or florins, to which he agrees, and then he manipulates Skellen by saying he has spies amongst his ranks, and if he delivers Ciri to him, then he would get him Vautier's job. Still not fully understanding why Ciri was so important and wanted by seemingly everyone, Skellen tasks Joanna to do some telepathic digging in Ciri's mind. Now, when Ciri was stranded in the Karath Desert, she used so much magical energy to stay alive that she somewhat drained herself to the point that since then, she hasn't been able to use magic at all. But when Joanna attempted to enter Ciri's mind, it suddenly filled her with so much magical energy that she forced Joanna out of her head and sent her flying to the ground. She then looked at one of the guards that was tasked with guarding her, and mentally attacks him to the point that blood begins flowing out of every hole in his face. She looks to the other, but the guard approached her and assured her that he was on her side, and he cut her restraints, likely being the spy that Vilgefortz warned Skellen about. She limps her way to Kelpie, and she rides. All the commotion alerted everyone in the camp to know what was going on. Skellen snuck to Ciri's projected path. He pulls out one of his trademark Orions, which is basically a Nilfgaardian throwing star, and lunges it at her as she passes. An explosion of blood erupts from her face. Ciri clung to Kelpie with all her might, refusing to fall off, and rides on. Bonhart emerged, but he was unable to pursue her, as the man who freed Ciri from her bonds threw himself at him. Bonhart was able to make short work of him, but he bought Ciri the time she needed to get away. In the future, back with Joanna in the prison, she digresses to her cellmates, tales in which men were completely unable to track Ciri's escape from the camp. In fact, she said that even their most accomplished trackers were unable to even remotely locate where she could have gone. Stories eventually surfaced, of spectral riders, wiping her prints from the ground. She had completely vanished, and no one knew even where to begin looking for her. Back in the swamps once again, Ciri was making her final preparations for leaving the swamps forever. She took a combination of goose grease and soot from the fireplace and wiped it all over her eyelids, a practice she continues throughout her adult life. Visigoda pleaded for her to stay until the spring, but she couldn't take any more loafing. She gives her thanks to the old hermit one last time and departs for the land of 100 lakes. A small inn set the stage for the end of Chapter 10. The blizzard-like weather outside forced an old beggar into the inn. Inside, 3 bandits were hiding from the cold. They were the bandits plaguing the area that Visigoda had told Ciri about. They sought amusement and had the old beggar tell them a tale. He tells them old legends about Samhain Eve, which is basically just All Hallows Eve, where the dead walk the earth before the winter. The bandits, however, quickly grow bored of his story and decide to fetch the local blacksmith's daughter, their intentions being less than honorable, as you can imagine. One of them leaves to prepare their horses, but returns almost instantly, as white as a ghost. A rider had approached on a black mare, and though she was wearing a cowl, they knew it was who they had been searching for. They staged an ambush, but she was ready for them. The 3 stood no chance as she slaughters them all faster than they can threaten her. Almost as if still telling his story, the beggar approaches Ciri and tells her, "Whoever you meet will not avoid their death," to which she replies, uninterestedly, "You're right." Unapologetic and uninterested, she now understands maybe all the stories and prophecies about her just may be right. The land of 100 lakes, formerly known as Miltracta, was home to many fishermen, but though it was only October, the frigid weather had caused most of the lakes to freeze in the fall. One fisherman had decided to spend the day ice fishing. He notices a rider who approached him, but luckily, she simply needed directions. He solves her curiosities regarding where she was, and then asks for further directions forward. She departed, and he decided to head home. On his return journey, he followed the young girl on the black horse's tracks back, and he was passed by 14 riders on horseback. The 14 riders were Ciri's pursuers, and after a month of waiting, they had finally found her, and they were catching up. Skellen, Rhys, Bonhart, Selborn, their tracker, Boreas, and 9 others were closing in. Using some undisclosed information from Vilgefortz, using a xenoglass, which is the magical phone that I mentioned earlier. Recently, however, Vilgefortz had gone quiet, and Rhys was worried. Because despite being close to their goal, all 14 trackers were tired, cold, untrusting, and many were plagued by nightmares of drowning. In the silent pursuit, Rhys reflects on the events of the past, which led him to be there in the first place. Now this will go without saying in a few moments, but regardless, it's important to know that the events with Yennefer on Skellige happened several months before what we are currently calling the present. Yennefer awoke surrounded by dead bodies and scattered remains of a longship. Her awakening, however, was not peaceful. Sharp pain erupted from her body as a rain of heavy boots mercilessly kicked her. Once the flurry had finally stopped, she was dragged to her feet by her attackers. She looked up and was greeted by a dark-haired man whose voice she recognized. Rhys welcomed her to his master's lair and told her that, with his fingers, he would teach her pain. But before the sadistic men could continue their beating, a voice roars over their laughter, commanding them to stop. Following their master's command, they drag Yennefer to him. They toss her in a chair and leave the two alone. However, it wasn't a simple chair they placed her in. She was bound at the ankles and wrists, in a chair that was intended for Ciri. Soon after, Vilgefortz began to speak. He was wearing a mask over his face, as he needed to cover up a massive burn he received at Ciri's doing. He explains to her that after leaving Geralt for dead on Thanedd, he entered the Tower of Gulls to pursue Ciri, and he nearly caught her, but she entered the portal before he could. Once she entered, the portal exploded, resulting in half of Vilgefortz's face being burned off. Yennefer remained silent while Vilgefortz spoke, all while he put needles and screws into her neck and hands, as well as tubes in her nose. As if the experience wasn't uncomfortable and painful enough, Yen had to listen to Vilgefortz digress his grievances and plans. He told Yen that he needed Ciri's placenta, and the fabled Sedna abyss that was responsible for the death of Ciri's mother and Yennefer's capture was his own personal maelstrom. He also tells her why the world was having such trouble finding Ciri. Her elder blood gave her an immunity to being detected by magic. He then revealed how, whether willing or not, she would help him find her. Using a combination of old-fashioned pain and magic, he could locate people who were close to her. He wasted no time in performing his torturous methods. Yennefer resisted the siege on her mind with all magic and will strength she had, but eventually she cracks. But she does not project Ciri. She instead revealed the location of her beloved Witcher, and so, Vilgefortz delegated finding Geralt to Shirou, and Ciri to his spy Rhys, which brings us back to him in the present. The hunting party had tracked Ciri to a lake. However, the weather was making things very difficult. The ice over the lake was much thinner than they would have liked, and the fog made seeing 10 feet in front of them impossible. But they pressed on anyway, knowing they were so close to achieving their goal. Things, however, get slightly more complicated when Joanna Selborne and 3 others in the party tell Skellen that they are returning back. Their fear of drowning or freezing to death outweighed their fear of being imprisoned for desertion. Skellen and Bonhart were furious at their demonstration of disloyalty, but they press on anyway. The wind was howling, and the fog was thick, and the thin ice forced them to dismount and go on foot. But they were now tracking Ciri's very clear and fresh footprints. They fan out to disperse their weight and walk further and further onto the fog-covered lake. Their excitement grows and grows, expecting to seize the girl at any second. Now, however, almost totally impossible to see, they marched and they marched. Amongst all the now present men, Bonhart never lost his composure and made the decision to turn back and get his horse. Skellen protested his idea, but did little to stop him. But knowing Ciri was so close drove him. Near the center of the icy lake, the now 9 men on Ciri's trail froze. The clear tracks they were following suddenly ended in the middle of the lake. Following the Nilfgaardians' excitement suddenly transformed into a gut-wrenching fear. Over the panic and howling of the wind, the men heard the grinding of metal against the ice. One of the men loses all control and runs. The others hear the grinding fly in the direction, followed by a howl of pain. And then, silence. Those remaining suddenly understood. The girl had skates and was picking them off one by one. Their fear was escalating, and they were out of options. She made another pass, and Skellen attempted to throw an Orien at her, but he accidentally killed one of his own men. He then grabs the cowering Rhys and tells him if he doesn't save them, then they were all going to die. Ciri came in for another pass, and the scared mage shoots a bolt of lightning at her. This, however, only worsened their situation. The spell sent a huge crack through the ice, resulting in the pitch-black, freezing lake below to swallow most of Skellen's men. Both Skellen and Rhys clung to the edge of the ice. One of the surviving soldiers somehow managed to pull himself out of the freezing lake, and even pull out his master as well, but none of them could manage to move, as they were all in great danger of freezing to death. Rhys hears the patter of skates slowly approaching him. Ciri watched him shiver with indifference. He pleaded to her, saying if she would pull him out, he would take her to Yennefer. She ignores his plea, and instead reminisces of a time when he told her with his fingers he would teach her pain. He continued to beg, and she uninterestedly skates away from him. She returned in a flash and skated over Rhys's fingers, sending him screaming before vanishing to the depths of the Black Lake, leaving nothing but his severed fingers on the surface. Hindsight is a pointless practice, but needless to say, Bonhart's instincts were spot on in knowing the situation he was walking into. He was now on his horse, going towards the ruins he knew to be Ciri's destination. Just then, the fog hanging over the lake lifted. He locks eyes with Ciri, who is now on Kelpie, and he furiously pursues her along the edge of the frozen lake. He closed the distance fast, but Bonhart began hearing spectral voices in his head. He thought Ciri was projecting them into his head in an effort to scare him, so he kept going, all while yelling at Ciri. Bonhart also believed what happened next was a hallucination that was projected by his prey, but that isn't the case at all. Several spectral riders emerge from the forest and scare Bonhart's horse onto the frozen lake, saying that the lion cub is theirs, not his, and they disappear. Bonhart is plunged into the lake by his scared horse and finds himself in a similar situation as Skellen, but he remained calm. He pulled a knife from his boot and stuck it into the ice and pulled himself from an icy grave. He looks around and finds Ciri. She approaches a stone ruin, and before both of their eyes, a magical tower materializes, and Ciri steps into the entrance. Once she enters, Bonhart watches as the tower disappeared, leaving him freezing and alone on the lake, screaming out his anger. The inside of the tower reminded Ciri of Kaer Morhen. She saw several doors opening before her, showing her images of her friends and loved ones. She even sees Visigoda. She tells him she used his daughter's skates and killed her pursuers, but spared Skellen in an attempt to meet neutral ground with him. He tells her that he died shortly after she left, but wishes her well on the next chapter of her story. Ciri carries on and reaches a clearing where an elf was playing a flute. Avallac'h finishes his song, looks up at Ciri, smiles, and simply asks, "What kept you?"